Well, good morning and many thanks for allowing me to be part of your Sunday morning this morning. I'm going to turn to the Old Testament of the Bible this morning, 1 Kings chapter 19, and I wanted to think with you just for a few moments about the experience of Elijah, one of the great Old Testament characters. And our little thought this morning is around the experience of Elijah when great men despair, And Elijah was one of the great characters of the Old Testament of the Bible. He was a great prophet. He was a man who performed miracles. He was a man who stood alone by the power of God against huge opposition. 850 prophets he stood against on Mount Carmel. He was a man who called down fire from heaven, a man to whom God listened, and a man, of course, who listened to God. And in 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah goes through a deep period of despair and despondency, discouragement, and perhaps in modern terms, depression. And I wanted to think just for a moment or two about that experience when great men despair. Now I'm turning to 1 Kings chapter 19, just for a couple of verses. You could read the whole chapter and I'm sure it would fill you in with some background, but just for the sake of time, chapter 19 and verse number 8 says, "And so Elijah rose, and he ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?'" Now, we do look to God to bless his word. In 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah has come from a period of great victory, a period in which he stood alone against 850 prophets, saw the fire of God falling, and saw what he might have interpreted as being revival. God stirring up the people of Israel to follow the one true and living God. But at the beginning of this chapter, his whole life appears to have fallen to pieces. He's now on the run, being pursued by his enemy who has threatened his life. And as you read down through this chapter, you get a sense of the deep despair of a man who previously had tasted victory, and a man who had previously enjoyed the presence and power of God. You would find, for example, he's in such a deep, dark place that he just wants to die. In verse number 3 and 4, he ran for his life. In verse 4, "It is enough now, Lord, take my life. I'm no better than my father's." He just wants to die. He wants to be left alone. He's out there in the wilderness, and even his close servant, he leaves him behind and off he goes into the wilderness. He has a sense of personal uselessness and worthlessness. And he says there in this chapter, "I'm no better than my fathers." Of course, that wasn't really true. Elijah was exceedingly better than his fathers, and he was a man whom God had used in a supernatural and miraculous way. He was one of the great characters of the Old Testament. But his life just implodes. It falls in itself, and he has this deep sense of despair and discouragement. He just wants to die and to be left alone. But I just wanted to encourage you this morning just by noticing, and these deep, dark, desperate experiences of Elijah, there are three great lessons he learns, three things that he enjoys that help him, encourage him, and lift him up out of that deep despair, even when a great man would despair. The first thing he discovers in his despair is this, that God cares. God cares. And on two occasions, at the beginning of chapter 19, Elijah, lying there just wanting to die, is raised up and roused up by an angel, and provision is made for him by the hand of God of food and drink. And verse number 5, "An angel touched him and said to him, 'Arise and eat.'" Twice it happens. God cares for Elijah. There was practicable provision. And of course, when we say that God cared for Elijah, it wasn't just a feeling or a sentiment, but God was caring in a practicable way by the provision that he had made for Elijah in the experience that he was passing through. And the same, of course, is true in our own experience. There are those times when you might feel deep despair, discouragement, and yet in those experiences, it is so often the case that we experience the hand of God practically, perhaps working through others round about us, or circumstances that come to bear in our life that are a particular help and a particular encouragement to us. Elijah knew that in 1 Kings 19. He might have felt deeply alone, but he was not alone. God cared for him in a practicable way. God cared. The second great lesson in his despondency was this, that not only did God care, but God spoke. God spoke. He went into a cave, verse 9, spent the night in that place, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And a little later on, you would find verse 12, and after the earthquake, a fire. The Lord was not in the fire. After the fire, a still small voice. You know, if you were to read the whole section that we've just taken some extracts out of, you would find that back there in chapter 18, it was the highlight, the high point of Elijah's experience. He was literally on the mountaintop, a place called Mount Carmel. He was facing the greatest opposition he had ever met in his life. 850 rabid prophets of Baal cutting themselves and cursing and trying to worship a false god. And yet he stood alone with God on his side, and he found a great victory there in seeing the hand of God move. But now he's here in a cave, away from everyone, in the quietness of the cave. That, mind you, wasn't a bad place to be. And oftentimes God brings us down from the mountaintop into a place that's quiet, that's separate, that's a place of solitude. You know, there is something very special about a cave. And if you've ever been in a cave, I'm sure you've noticed it yourself. One of the great features of a cave is, of course, that it echoes. It echoes. And in that place of solitude, silence, the silence of the cave, the echo of the cave, there is something that Elijah is able to experience that he could not have experienced in the hustle, the bustle, the noise, the victory of Mount Carmel. He could hear the still small voice of God. And of course, it is in that still small voice that he finds that God speaks. God not only cares, but he speaks in a still small voice. Not in the big dramatic things and the earthquake and so forth that you read about, but in that still small voice. Still today, God speaks through his word. Open it in the quietness, prayerfully, and listen to the voice of God speaking in a still small voice. Firstly, Elijah discovers that God cares. Secondly, he discovers that God speaks. And thirdly, despite the fact that everything in his life appears to have gone pear-shaped, nothing appears to have gone to his particular plan, everything appears out of control and chaotic. Thirdly, he discovers here in chapter number 19, as God would speak in that still small voice, he discovers that God has a plan. God cares, God speaks, and God has a plan. It might seem on the surface that everything is chaotic and out of control, and yet nonetheless there is the hand of God that is there orchestrating and moving things according to his plan and purpose. A little time ago, Yvonne gave me a little piece of embroidery. It was a little bookmark that she had made for me for my birthday, and it was done with kind of cross stitch. Now on the one side of it, it was just a hodgepodge of different threads. You couldn't have made anything out from the back of that bookmark. You'll have seen these cross stitches, I'm sure, done over the years. On the back of it, just a hodgepodge of threads. But when you turn it over, what appeared to be just a hodgepodge of threads on the back, you can see the pattern and the picture, and on the front of it there was the picture of a castle. You would never have known from the back, but from the front of it, the picture of a castle. And so here in 1 Kings 19, as the tables appear to have turned on Elijah, as persecution has mounted, as he feels very much alone and is on the run, this is not a disaster, but rather under the hand of God. The persecution has in fact had purpose. The persecution that Elijah and others have experienced has in fact in the hand of God been not so much persecution but purification. And through that attack that has been experienced in the world, God has set apart, it says here in chapter number 19, God has set apart those that are there for himself. Verse 18, yet have I reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal. 7,000 have stood for God despite the persecution. 7,000 have remained faithful to God. And out of that fire of affliction, there is purification that has come. God had a purpose. God had meaning. And it is, of course, only when we turn to Christ that we find meaning and purpose in the lives that we live. The key, of course, to Elijah's experience in 1 Kings 19 was a personal relationship with the God of heaven. And it was because he had that personal relationship, he could hear the voice, and he knew the care of the God of heaven, and he could see the purpose that God had for him in his life. It is, of course, absolutely fundamental that we come to know the God of heaven in a personal way, and that only through his Son. He who has the Son has life, says the Word of God. Thanks very much for allowing me to be part of your Sunday morning this morning. If you found this message of help or of encouragement, do remember to like, comment and share down the bottom, and that just lets the Facebook system know that there is perhaps something that might be of help to other people, and then it shares it round the contact. So many thanks. Good morning.